Hi everyone, in this video we are going to be making a textured fringe embellished loom bracelet. And here is an example or a version of what we are going to make. So I'm just gonna put this on to show you what it looks like. So here's what it looks like on the wrist. So a lot of fringe and different kinds of seed bead finishes, and also using different sizes. So for this tutorial, I'm going to do a special challenge, which is to use as many of these beads as possible in this project, except for the budget beads, because I have other better beads that I can use. And also this is the sampler for my last video where I introduced all kinds of different seed beads. And I'm also going to be taking sizes 15 to size 6 and using all of them up except for the budget beads. So yeah, it's going to be quite freestyled, and I'm actually not even sure how it's going to look once it's all been put together, but it'll be interesting. And the most important part is that this tutorial is more about the technique, so showing you how to do the fringe and to embellish a loom bracelet. So yeah, let me get to cutting up and piling up all the beads here and here. All right, so I'm just going to move this aside for a second, and I'm just going to show you how we are going to modify our loom to do this project. So the first thing that we need to do is take out the knobs and also take out this bar and also the knobs. So it's just going to be like this. So the reason why I took out the knobs is because I'm going to be warping by looping this thread around the loom. And the reason for that is because I want to have longer warp ends that I can cut later on, so that it will be easier for me to weave the warp ends into the beads when I'm doing the finishing. So I'll show you that when the time comes. But for now, let's get to warping. So for the warp, I'm going to be using my Coats & Clark upholstery thread in the color white, and it's 100% nylon. And you want to use a bit of a thicker, more robust thread like this because the bracelet has a lot of beads on it, so it's a bit heftier, it's a bit thicker and heavier. So to carry all of that weight, you just want a bit of a heavier type of thread. So I recommend this thread versus the thinner John bead thread. So this we will be using for the weft to sew the beads in, but for the warp I recommend this heavier duty thread. So to start warping, I'm going to unwind a bunch of this thread from the spool, and I'm going to flip the loom, and I'm going to put the thread under, and I'm going to tie a double knot in the center. So just tie a double knot like this. So that's just a simple double knot, and I'm just going to pull to tighten. So that's pretty good. That's okay. I can tighten it a little bit more actually. And then I'm going to flip this loom so the knot is now in the backside. And I'm going to do a row of 7 beads for this loom portion. So it's going to be 7 across. And that's just because I like this thickness. It looks pretty nice, but you can definitely do yours thicker or thinner, but just know that you just need to adjust the quantity of beads in that case. So I want to do 7 beads in a row, so that means I'm going to need 8 warp strands. So I'm just going to start 4 from the middle so that I can center my piece. So this is my center. I've put an arrow on it. So it's just going to be 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm going to put my first warp strand here. And I'm going to do the same for the other side so that they will be even. And I'm actually going to tighten my string again because it got loose there. Okay, so I've just centered my thread on both sides. You also want to make sure that you want your knot to be in the middle of your loom. And now I'm going to run my thread, and I'm going to double the first and the last threads of the warp. So I'm going to put this thread right back in the same slot because that will be my last or my first, it doesn't matter, warp strand. And then I'm just going to go ahead and loop around until I have 8, and then I'm going to double the 8th and final strand. So here's the knot for my last strand, and here's the knot for my first strand. It's not perfectly in the middle, but it's good enough. So to count my warp strands, you've got the first one, which is doubled, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, which is also doubled. So the first and the last strands are doubled by looping them twice along the same slot. And so these 8 create the 7 spaces that you're going to need for the 7 rows of beads for the loom bracelet base. Alright, so after putting on your warps and putting your knot somewhere in the middle and the back for that, we are going to just tighten the warps a little bit to give it some good tension by shoving a Sharpie in between these strands of thread and the board. And to do that, I'm going to use my super thick, super strong sewing needle, not your beading needle, just a regular thick sewing needle, and I'm just going to pry the thread apart like this from the board, and I'm going to shove my trusty Sharpie in there, and that will help give my warps some more tension. So now I've got really good tension, so we can start beading the base of the loom. And to do that, we are going to be using size 8/0 seed beads. So even though size 11/0 seed beads is the most common for loom work, because we're going to be doing embellishments, we're going to be running a lot of thread through these seed beads. So you're going to need the larger 8/0 size, because the size 8/0 has bigger holes, so you can run more thread through them. So my recommendation and my personal preference of the brand is Toho 8/0 seed beads. And that's because if you watched my previous video introducing different kinds and brands of seed beads, you'll know that the Tohos are relatively wider and more barrel shaped compared to the other brands. And what that does is it gives us a good amount of spacing in between the beads so that when we do our fringes, there's not going to be overcrowding, and also you'll be able to fit larger seed beads like 6/0 sizes in your embellishments and fringing without any issue. So I have different size 6/0 seed beads here, but these larger yellow ones are easier to see. These are size 6/0, and so they're quite large. And so the relatively wider Toho 8/0 seed beads compared to the other brands can fit this quite comfortably. So for my weft thread, so the horizontal thread that will be used to put on the beads, I will be using my Bead Good Thread in the color white. And I'm going to be putting about 6 feet on my needle. I'm going to take the tail end of my thread and I'm going to tie a knot on my leftmost warp thread. So if you are left-handed, you're just going to do the opposite and you're going to put it on the rightmost warp thread. But I am right-handed, so I'm going to put it on the leftmost thread, and I'm going to give myself about an 8-inch tail, and I'm just going to tie a simple overhand knot, just a simple knot, and put the knot about an inch away from the edge. And I'm going to put the rest of my thread under all of the vertical warp threads. Okay, so to start, you're going to pick up 7 of the Toho 80 seed beads that you're going to be using for your base. And you're going to drop that down your thread and slide the beads to the end. And this knot is going to keep your beads from slipping out. And you're going to put a bead in each of the spaces between the vertical warp threads like this. And you're gonna push up the beads with your finger like this so that they stick out. And then you're gonna take your needle and you're gonna go over all of the vertical warp threads and through each of the beads. So you're gonna go over like this. And you're gonna make sure not to pierce your vertical thread. So just go over. And this should be quite easy because size 8 beads are quite large and have big holes. So like that. And you're gonna pull your thread through. And in the beginning, the spacing will not be perfect. There will be some gaps because the threads are not yet being snugged up against these beads and conforming to the size of the beads, but we will take care of that when we do the second row. So here's the second row of beads, and I've slid them down already to where all my warp strands are, and I'm going to put them in all of their spaces like this. And then I'm going to put my needle through them again, going over all of the vertical warp strands like this. And when I pull, I'm going to start tightening up my horizontal thread so that all the vertical threads will be pulled inwards like this. And there are no more gaps in between each of the beads. So here's my third row, and the beads should go into the respective slots a lot easier because the spacing has already been established. So you can put your needle through quite easily and it should go a lot faster from now on. So from here, you're just going to take your chosen 80 seed bead and you're just going to bead up until 1 inch less than your final desired size. And your final desired size is determined by how long you want your bracelet to be. So my wrist is 5.5 inches around, and I want my final size to be 6 inches, and that includes the clasp. So I'm going to be beading 5 inches because 1 inch is going to be taken up by the clasp. Alright, so I've just finished my 5-inch long beaded section, and so what I'm going to do now actually is tie off and weave in all of my weft thread ends. So I only had to use one thread to do the whole thing, so I only have 2 ends to tie off and weave in. So I'm going to do this one, and I'm also going to do this end right here. So to tie off the weft thread, I'm just going to go back 1 row and I'm going to exit somewhere in the middle, like here. And then I'm going to go up 1 and I'm going to grab a thread bridge. The thread bridge is a thread that is running across, and there are 2 thread bridges, one running on top and one running below. And so I'm just going to pick up the one that's running on top, which is this one right there. And I'm going to draw a knot. And I'm going to go with my needle into the opposite direction. And I'm going to come out somewhere in the middle, like that. And I'm gonna go up again and grab the upper thread bridge, because when we're looming, we're passing the thread under and then we're coming around on top and going over. So that's why there's two. So I'm just gonna grab the one that's sitting on top, like this one, that one. So I'm just gonna grab that thread bridge and I'm going to draw another knot. And I'm going to put my needle, again going in the opposite direction and coming out somewhere in the middle. And now I'm gonna do a zigzag back down one in the opposite direction, like this. Come out somewhere in the middle. Zigzag down again in the opposite direction, like this. Come out somewhere in the middle. And make a loop like this. Going back up. And going back down. So I basically just went around in a circle like that. And then I'm just gonna do one more going down this way. And I'm just gonna go to the end and cut. So this isn't really an exact science, but basically you just wanna do enough zigzags and loops that your thread's gonna be quite secure. And I'm coming out this way because I know that this first row is going to go inside the clasping, so it's fine. I'm just going to cut my thread and that should be just okay. So just do the same for this tail and any other tails you might have. Alright, so once you're done with your loomed section and tying off and weaving in your ends, we're going to start the fringe embellishment part, and the thread I'm using for that is the weaving or the weft thread, which is the Bead Good Thread in white. So I've just threaded my needle, and for the fringe embellishment we are going to be working from top to bottom. So while we were looming, we were working from bottom to top, but this time I'm going to work from top to bottom. So I'm going to secure the new piece of weaving thread by going in between two beads in the last row and grabbing a thread bridge like this and drawing the new thread down until I get close to the tail. And then I'm just going to tie a simple overhand knot to anchor this thread. And I'm going to draw that knot on this thread bridge in between those two beads. And then I'm going to weave this thread in. So from there, I'm just going to go right. Come out somewhere in the middle. And then I'm just going to secure this thread by doing some circles and zigzags. So I'm just going to zigzag over to the left. Like that. And then I will just loop back around this way. I might also just draw a knot here, just so I have a second knot, because I tend to like to do minimum of 2 knots if I can. And then after putting a knot there, I'm going to go back this way and come out of the very last bead. So I ended up here, and I'm going to flip over. And I'm going to put my needle in the third row over top of all the vertical lines like that. And then I'm going to flip over again. And I'm going to pull my thread. So where I want to end up is on the right side and the back, like that. So this weaving thread is behind all of the vertical threads, like this, from the back. And I'm going to cut off this thread because we don't need this tail anymore. So now I'm going to show you how to fringe. So we're going to start fringing in the middle in these slots, starting from the third row. And the reason for that is the first row is going to be taken up by the sliding and tube clasps. So the first row of beads is going to go in there. So that's going to disappear. And then the second row is a little bit of like a buffer. And then the third row is where we are going to start fringing. So to start fringing, I'm also only going to go in the middle slots. So I'm not going to start fringing on this end. So I'm going to put my needle through the first bead and draw my thread through like this. So now that your thread is coming out of this slot in between these two 8/0 beads, I'm going to show you how to fringe. So first I'm going to pick up a size 6 seed bead followed by a size 11/0 seed bead like this. And I'm going to drop that down. So it's going to sit right there, and I'm going to skip this first bead and I'm going to put my needle through the second bead, the bottom bead, and I'm going to put my needle through this second bead and pull my thread through. And if your thread looks like this, what you can do is just grab a hold of the small bead loosely and pull your thread, and it's going to snug that small bead against this larger bead. And a tip that I have is that I like to make it so that the bead is sort of like standing up like that. So I'm going to call this smaller bead my stopper bead because it's getting pulled down against the hole of this larger bead and acting like a stopper to keep this larger bead from slipping through the thread and falling off. So once you pull your thread through this second bead, your thread is now going to come out of the slot or gap between the second and the third bead. So now I'm going to show you another kind of fringe. So I've put 3 size 11 seed beads on my needle, and I'm going to draw that down. Like that. And once again, I'm going to skip this first bead and I'm only going to put my needle through the bottom 3 beads like this. And then I'm going to put my needle back into the same slot that my thread was coming out of and through this bead and into the next slot like this. And I'm going to draw down my thread until this last stopper bead is snug against all the other beads like that. So that's my second fringe. So now your thread is coming out of the slot between this third bead and this fourth bead from the right, like this. So now I'm going to do another variation and grab an 8/0 seed bead and an 11/0 seed bead. I'm going to drop that down, and again I'm going to skip the first bead because that is my stopper bead, and I'm going to pass my needle through the 8/0 seed bead back into the slot that I'm coming out of and through the next bead over like this. And I'm going to draw down my thread and sit that bead on top of the bottom bead like that. So now my thread is coming out in the slot between these two beads, and so I'm going to do another fringe. This time I'm going to try picking up an 8/0 seed bead followed by a few different 11/0 seed beads like this. I drop them all down and I'm going to skip the first bead, and I'm going to put my needle through the 3 other beads here at the bottom, and I'm going to go back through the same slot that my thread is coming out of and put my needle through the next bead over like this and draw my thread down. And snug that bead up against these other beads. I grabbed a 6/0 and an 8/0. So I'm going to skip the first bead and I'm going to put my needle through this second bottom bead and back into that slot where this thread is coming out of and into that bead and coming out in the next slot over. And I'm holding onto my 8/0 and pulling my thread, which will let me snug that in easier like that. I picked up 4 11/0 seed beads and a 15/0 for my stopper bead. So I've slid everything down and I'm going to skip this small 15/0 and go through the other 4 11/0s like this, and back down to that slot where my thread is coming out of and through this last bead. And I'm going to pull that thread and snug that stopper bead up against the other beads like this. So here are all my fringes. And now I'm going to do the same for the next row. So to get to the next row, what I'm going to do is flip over to the back side. So we've just put fringes on the 3rd row, so I'm going to put my needle through the back side of the 4th row so that I'll be coming out of the correct side when I flip back over like this. And now your thread is coming out of the back side of that 4th row like that. So I'm going to put my needle through this first bead and start fringing again along these middle slots. So I'm going to pull my needle through. And my thread is now coming out in between these 2 slots. So I'm going to do one last fringe and then we'll talk a little bit about pointers. So I'm using a gold 8/0 bead and a Ceylon pink 11/0 bead as the stopper. So I've slid them down and I'm going to skip this first bead and I'm going to put my needle through the bottom 8/0 bead and back through the slot where that thread is coming out of and into the next bead. I'm going to pull my thread. And if you have this loose loop thread, you can just keep pulling down until this is snugged over, or you could pull it up like this and pull gently until you draw that top bead down to the bottom bead. So this is basically fringing. So basically it's beads that are being held in place by this end stopper bead. Now I do have a couple of pointers. The first is that you want your stopper bead to be larger than the whole of the second bead below it so that the stopper bead doesn't fall through the hole. And that might happen if you use a 15-0 against a 6-0. So here's actually a Toho 15-0 and a Toho 6-0, and you can see that the 15-0 just passed into and through the hole of the 6-0. So it's not gonna work if you try to use this 15-0 as a stopper bead for this 6-0. Your 6-0 is just gonna fall off your fringe. So as a general rule, I typically only use a 15-0 as a stopper for an 11-0 right below it. A second general guideline that I have is that I personally prefer to always put my larger beads below smaller beads and stack them up that way, kind of like a toddler stacking toy. And that's because if you put the larger beads over your smaller beads, your fringe might be a bit more unstable. And also, if you put the larger beads on top of smaller beads, then you might obscure the smaller beads below it. So by doing it in such a way that your larger beads are below your smaller beads, then you can see both beads and it will create more texture and variation in your fringes. So other than those two things, you can work in a pretty free-form manner and just pick up random beads according to your preference. And so I've picked up 5 of the same 11-0 beads, and I'm going to skip the first one and put my needle through all the 4 bottom beads like this, and put my needle through the same slot where the thread is coming out of and into the next bead. So before I put my needle through, I actually want to show you another thing you can do, which is a loop. So instead of coming out in the next slot over, I'm actually going to put my needle through to the second to the next slot over. And I'll tell you why. So here's the fringe that I have just made, and it's going into this slot. And I skipped this slot and I went directly into this slot because I'm going to make a loop. And this slot is already taken over by this fringe. So when I do a loop, I need 2 slots. So I'm going to be using these 2 next slots. So to do the loop, I've picked up 3 11-0 beads, followed by an 8-0 bead, and 3 more 11-0 beads. And I'm going to draw that down. To make the loop, I'm going to circle back and I'm going to put my needle through this slot on the right. And then I'm going to skip the next slot and come out of this second bead right there. Once I pull my thread, you can see that I am making a loop. So arrange your loop so that this middle larger bead is sitting properly and there's minimal thread showing. So here's a close-up of the loop. There's a lot going on, so hopefully you can still see. This side of the loop is coming out of this slot right there. And this side of the loop is coming out of this slot right here. So I really only want one thing coming out of each slot. So that's why when we finished with this fringe, we skipped the slot, came out of the slot, made our loop, and looped back over to this right slot, and then skipped the slot again so that we can come out to a free slot, if that makes sense. Let's do another loop. So we want 2 free slots. So my thread is coming out of here, but what I really want is for it to come out of here. so that there will be 2 free slots. So let me just put my needle through this bead. So now my thread is coming out of this slot right here, and this slot is free for me to circle back to it. So let me just put on some beads. So this time, just to make it easier for you to see, I put on 3 purple beads, 1 silver lined red bead, and 3 pink beads, and I'm going to slide it down. So I've slid everything down, and now I'm going to put my needle back into that free spot like this. And as you're pulling, it's going to make that loop like that. So now I have 2 loops, and I'm coming out of this slot, which is already taken. So I'm ready to just go through this last bead right here. And start my next row. So now I'm coming out of the last bead, and I'm not gonna put a fringe or anything on that last bead. I'm just going to turn this around and go through the back again. And I'm going to go down 1 row like this from the back. Turn it over again. And when you pull this, it's going to snug whatever is the last thing you did here. And now I'm going to put my needle through the first bead, so I'm coming out of that first slot, and we can do more fringes and loops. So from here, you're just going to continue with your fringe and have fun picking up different color and size combinations of beads for your fringes and your loops. And I prefer to do more fringes than loops. So I'll probably do like 80% fringes and 20% loops, but you can do whatever you like. So just keep going, and I'll meet you back here, and if you run out of thread, I'll show you how to add more thread.